Sam, why are you hiding? Sam, why prolong the inevitable?
Until Dawn is a third-person horror adventure game that follows 8 teenagers who are lured back to a snowy mountain where their friends died the year before.
Why kid yourself into thinking you can get away? Don't you know I can smell you, Sam? I can smell your fear.
Atmosphere. The whole game is suspended on a thin layer of tension that's brought about by the suspenseful music and the cinematic look to the game. Its movie style is done really well, and many locations from the creepy mines to the derelict sanatorium are so richly detailed and vaguely spooky that it's easy to get lost in them. There's a lot of small things at play that keep the atmosphere going, from the wind being audible in nearly every part of the game, providing a low rumble to back the events, to the dialogue choices which can either make drastic or imperceptible changes to the story, and then the constant threat of quick-time events. Even things like camera angles make things more ominous as characters disappear down long winding corridors or into increasingly darkened mine shafts. It feels like the atmosphere doesn't go very deep even in the game's most frightening moments and locations, but it doesn't really let up either, maintaining its surface level of suspense the whole game, even in moments of relative peace. That's one Harry Mason.
No! Oh, God! Jessica! No, Jessica. No, Jessica.
Scares. The game's scares aren't hugely original and many of them can be cheap and predictable, but I never left feeling disappointed with what the game delivered. That being said, there are so many moments where the characters play pranks on each other just to have a jump scare for the player in an otherwise slow chapter, and the early parts of the game are full of these moments. A lot of them are laughable in the most endearing way. It really goes back to slasher movies of the 2000s with more drawn out runtime, and the more often I replay the game, the more fun a lot of the jump scares become. The chase sequences are sort of hit and miss, with certain characters having plot armor for most of the game, meaning that quick-time events are more entertaining to fail than they are to pass. But for a lot of characters without plot armor, it's pretty intense trying to make the right decisions, and some of the options that lead to better outcomes for characters often have more difficult to complete quick-time events. My favourite aspect of the game is how Until Dawn uses the motion controls of the PlayStation 4's controller to measure if the player is moving. It's unique and used so infrequently that it's genuinely frightening. From my observations, it seems that sometimes the controller moves on its own, so you can't just place it on the floor and instantly win the section, which is a great way to force the player to do it. These sections are often in life and death scenario and puts real pressure on the player not to make mistakes. Until Dawn's scares aren't exactly unique and very rarely impactful, and whilst it has some interesting features, they're not really enough that doesn't come off as silly or predictable to give it the point. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The soundtrack elegantly switches between the cinematic, with disturbing and ominous sweeping orchestral pieces, and creepy chimes and eerie melodies that even give what would be otherwise boring sections a feeling of tension. The music hypes up to a frantic high during chase sequences and action sequences, where the orchestra just goes wild with plucking strings and scratching noises. In the background there's always the sound of wind blowing, indoors or out, and the low rumble really feels like it adds more tension to the atmosphere. The game tends to emphasize creepy moments with low rumbling strings, and this is another technique used in movies to make certain moments feel creepier than they actually are. But in my opinion, it does work quite well, along with the loud stabs that accompany jump scares. That's sometimes a little too loud, but that's almost certainly the point. The sound effects are extremely crisp, with everything from the sound of snow crumpling underfoot to the screams of wild animals being immaculate and realistic. The voice acting is done really well, with a wide variety of characters, from the analyst's foreboding words of wisdom, to Chris who's always making jokes, and Emily's whose personality comes across as abrasive.
I would like to understand your feelings toward people who fear the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, and other intangible forces beyond the veil. Do you share this fear?
The sound space is pretty good, but there's not a huge need for directional audio, but they've gone and done it anyway, which is always nice. The sound design is really top grade stuff. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. Until Dawn's gore is sickeningly detailed, and there's a fair amount of variety, with the best part about it being the many deaths the characters can have at the fate of the player. From twisting heads off to being cut in half, the deaths, like many old school slasher movies, are fun to watch, with the caveat of sacrificing a character you may like. As mentioned before, a few characters have plot armor, but they can all die before the end of the game. There's a lot of other things in the game too, from some of the best looking blood to some seriously creepy bodies with unnerving details, amputated pigs' heads, and lots of other things. The gore isn't a huge focus of the game, which is good, but when it does crop up, it's usually very impressive. That's 3 Harry Masons.
Before we begin, there are a few things I need to make sure you understand. You see, no one can change what happened last year. The past is beyond our control. You have to accept this in order to move forward.
Story. The game begins with a group of teens playing a prank on their friends that goes gravely wrong and ends up killing Beth and Hannah Washington in an unforeseen accident. Exactly a year later, they're summoned back to the mountain by Josh, the brother of the 2 sisters, who's insistent that they put the events of the past behind to have a good time. Unfortunately, that's not how things go. Until Dawn's story is one of the most entertaining in any of the horror games I've played, for the sheer amount of content and variety that makes it up. There are an overwhelming number of clues that can lead to dialogue between characters, newspaper clippings that reveal things dating back to the 1950s, and even a documentary that's pieced together when you gather enough of the totems.
Sometime after, the prospectors came to mine this mountain until a cave-in trap.
The characters themselves are likeable enough to not want them to die, but there's also enough friction between them to make things interesting when they interact. Some of the dialogue can be cheesy, but it's still entertaining nonetheless. The biggest selling point is obviously the butterfly effect, which allows choices made to impact the events of the story, and even after playing the game through 6 and 7 times, I still find randomly new dialogue sections and events that I've just never seen before. There's a lot of different storylines going on at the same time, and constantly switching characters feels like you never get bored of one thing before something new crops up, with the overarching question being what's really going on in the mountain. The analyst sections allow the player to make choices that will impact the story later on or change the way things are represented, and each part with him is very intense and mysterious. On the other hand, there's some minor flaws with the way things are done that I'm not a huge fan of. The totems provide premonitions into possible futures as a warning, which can spoil upcoming events in the game. I've never thought these were an especially good idea and would have preferred if they just left the events as surprises. Also, the game will often leave pivotal changes to the story, down to whether the player can find specific items scattered throughout the game or not, which can be frustrating if you don't know what you need and where to find it to get the outcome you're after. Really though, Until Dawn is mostly as entertaining as it is because of the replayability the unique choose your own adventure format provides. It's as fun to play through now as it was the first time I played it, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Until Dawn is not the best horror game ever made, but it's one of the most consistently entertaining with its shape-shifting story and likeable yet fun-to-kill characters. It's like being the director to your own slasher movie, it only gets more interesting with each playthrough. It remains one of the most replayable horror games I can think of.
That's what I say.
Hope everyone's excited for Halloween this year. I've recorded this in May and hope that by October the lineup is still looking good. Not every video for the month is going to have these outros because there's just so many to do, but thanks for watching and stay tuned for what's coming up next. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I didn't save everyone, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.